So we went back and forth on this detail for where a wall light would go on this door. And it would mount somewhere in here, and then the fixture would come out and kind of hang down. And I'm not very tall, but I'm almost 6 foot, and I don't really like things right by my head, or it feels kind of like it's coming down in. So instead, we opted to put it up above the door. So we just split the difference between here. We measured and we checked a couple of the ones online. It looks like they're somewhere between like 13 inches, 16 inches, something like that. So that would work out right here. Second thing I did, and they get this kind of trim ring and box and everything. That's a standard piece. The other thing I did was it's almost 16 feet to right here, so I buried the joint in behind the trim rings. I think once we put the fixture on there and it comes down, you won't even know there's a joint there. So thought I'd walk through this detail real quick for you, just in case anybody's looking for ideas or needs to take on something similar. A few tricks I've come up with for cutting these and making sure I get them right. So there's a little foam piece here, and if you're going to measure from the last piece of foam that's underneath, that's where your measurement should go. So basically foam to foam, and that gives it this little overlip. So when I measure, I try to, you're going to have a right or a left is where you want to keep this tab. And so I try to orient the pieces on the saw table the way that I would be looking at the wall. And so if I write a measurement down, let's say it's 89.5 or something, I'll write 89.5 R, and that means a right tab. And that means I'm going to measure from the right 89.5. And so by putting this down, slide the piece, hook onto the foamy part, mark it, and cut it. So on this cut piece, we've cut both sides of it. This was another cut, and so it doesn't have a right tab, it doesn't have a left tab. But hang on to these because they work great in between windows. So how do I choose if it should be a right or a left, or which way I should put my joints? There's a lot of different like tips or things that people will say or factors that go into it. One of the things that I took into consideration is where would I typically be standing if I was looking at a wall? And so on our front porch, the way that you would approach the front door, I made it so that the overlaps were going away, so this piece would be under this overlap. And the reason you do that is you can see the end. If one comes in, you can actually see that little joint there, but when you look down it and there's an overlap, you don't see it as much. And so on this wall in particular, there isn't any kind of prevailing winds or sun or anything like that would be a factor that I would take into this, but I have woods over there, but I have a real clear area actually in behind where that camera is. And so I assume that most times when people would be looking at this wall, they're probably either approaching the door from this angle or they are looking at this wall from this angle. And so for that reason, I made this piece would always overlap the next piece coming in. So you're looking at overlaps rather than looking at the end of the joint. So hopefully that makes sense. I don't know if that really does make sense. But that's how I figured out on this particular wall. And it's kind of how I go about each wall. Each wall I pick, and I think I overanalyze it, to be honest with you. And I think about which way I'd probably be looking at that wall.
Hi.
For cutting the trim, I actually found this blade works really well. It's for laminates and non-ferrous like trim. And I think why it works really well, you turn it backwards anyways, and so these just kind of end up grinding through. But the kerf and then the blade width, the blades I think are really thin, and so they don't get as much buildup on the face of the blade, so it actually slides through there pretty good. This is a regular blade, like a regular wood blade, and you see all the buildup that winds up on the blade. And I think it's just because these blades are a little bit wider, or the blade part of it's a little bit thicker, and maybe the kerf is a little bit thinner, so it just ends up getting a lot of the foam and everything just ends up sticking on it. If you're building your own barn or your own house or anything like that, and you have this luxury, I would recommend starting your siding, and when you get to the row where you're going to put any of these blocks or fixtures, get pretty close to it and then measure and lay out all of your horizontal lines and see if you can position these according to the piece of siding. At least I guess my personal opinion, but it looks best if you can put these flanges where the siding is the thickest. So, and that is where these rows line up. If you have this trim ring land in the middle here, you see a really big gap underneath it. And so if you can kind of measure out and lay out and get these to sit more like this, where the siding will fill up most of this gap here, that's kind of ideal. So you see, you're only really seeing it, just a taper of it over here on this side. And the way that I do that is that just measure whatever it is. In this case, it was this box, but find where this bottom edge is and maybe where this top edge is, and try to lay out those horizontal lines where those are. So you kind of see this, the way this one worked out. If I can get this off here. So kind of laying one out about like this. This is how this box ended up. I did the outlets the same way, where I could J around them. I could put the J channel and make the J channel sit in one of the thicker spots. But you're wanting to pretty much make it so that one piece will pass the top. So you can either just line the top up. If it's about going to take up a whole panel, these are 7-inch profiles. If you're doing Dutch lap, it's probably a lot different, but if you've got a big profile here, like we've got about a 7-inch profile, this box is going to sit mostly in one of these panels. So we line up the top edge here, you'll be able to slip the next piece. We'll be able to just slide or clip right over the top of that box. And then this piece under here will pretty much end right here. Now you can set it right about the top edge of this and cut a little piece of the foam out. But I thought this looked the best, so that the trim rings were filling, and on the bottom you're looking at something like this and something like this. And so here's an example of that in action. This, for these blocks, these are going to be our disconnects for our air conditioning. And where that J is, there's a little bit of a notch out for that piece and a little bit down here. But you can see from the bottoms or from the tops, you don't see a really big gap. And you're really only seeing the gap kind of on those sides there. So I thought this looked the best. It took me a while to get this sorted out and get this detail figured out. So I thought I might share it, in case you want to see what it looks like when you don't do that. These are my first couple where I obviously learned not to put them. I had mounted them, and where they came out, the height, I just put the height what most of these get mounted at. But the way that it landed in the pieces, you can see there's a really big gap at the top and a really big gap at the bottom. That's when before I put any more outlets on the wall, I started to put siding first. Then I could measure up, and I could place these a whole lot better than this side. This is the side of the garage, the north side of the garage, so it was unfortunate that I had to learn this after having done one already. But all the rest of them will be a lot better. And so to compare that, if you place your outlets right, this is what they'll end up looking like. So you can see the top, most of the J is filled up by the top piece, and then down at the bottom, it's mostly filled up. So it just about looks flush. It almost looks flush mounted, and your gap is in behind there. I thought these looked the best. That means I changed all the heights for all these outlets, and I tend to first put my starter strip, or maybe one or two of these rows of siding first, and then I can measure up, mark it, mount the box, and then I work around the box, and then I keep on going up. Well, I hope this helps somebody. It's time to get back to work. All right, getting those installed, that finishes off the front end of the house. I'm not going another row up because I really want to be able to put the tongue and groove in first. And then I can, whatever I'm going to do there, I'll know what that finish, the finish depth or thickness is there. So we're only going to go that high, and then once we put in our tongue and groove ceiling, then I'll finish out whatever I'm going to do for that top row. There's really only a small gap between the top of the lineals and the I think the tongue and groove is going to wind up, if it's like 3/4 of an inch. And so I really don't want to put anything there now and then have a gap. So I'll be able to put the ceiling in, butt something up nice and tight to it. You won't really see that much of a gap, and then we'll figure out what we're going to do to fill in that space. So that's it for the front of the house. Now it's time to move on to the back of the house.